Good morning, everybody. Welcome to CertaPay's Coffee Break series. This is coffee break number 17, and that means it's October. So in case you weren't sure, that's where we are in 2021, which is going by in warp speed. I think everybody can imagine or agree with that. So CertaPay is really excited to have you here with us during this series and for all this information. We're happy to cover any topics that you want to hear. Let us know. And today we're going to cover the very important ADA, tell you what it means, why it's important, and all the good things about it, and the exciting things about it, which Tammy will be able to do. And so I'm your host and moderator, Rachel Comella. And I'm here with Tammy Dawson, our VP of HR for the HR team. And she is one of our most experienced senior members of the team with all of this amazing knowledge. So super excited to have Tammy as our presenter this morning. I am drinking a delicious Guatemala from Temple. I also have Cindy's dark roast espresso.
Perfect.
Cheers to that. Yep.
Well,
so, Tammy, are you drinking any coffee?
The Diet Dr. Pepper, okay. Some things just never change. So my 1 cup of coffee many hours ago and moved to my Diet Dr. Pepper.
All right. Well, take it away.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm so glad to join everybody today to talk through the Americans with Disability Act and particularly reasonable accommodations and what all of that means. I would say I'm going to call myself out from the very beginning on how long I've been in this profession. The original Americans with Disability Act passed in 1990. Yes, I was working HR, had actually already been in HR for a few years at the time. And it was a huge, momentous time in employment history and in just really history on overall, not only public accommodations, which is a huge portion of the ADA, it is a massive piece of legislation, but there's 2 titles, Title I and Title V, that are specific to the employment sector. And it is absolutely one of the larger pieces of legislation that we navigate in dealing with employees and applicants and through all the terms and conditions of employment during one's career with your particular business. The Amendments Act passed in 2008. So for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm just going to really merge all of that together. So we're going to just, for the most part, call all of it just the ADA. The Amendments Act did pass many, many years later, and now a lot of more years have passed. And there are some nuances, but we're going to just kind of merge all of it together because it really doesn't matter now that we're so many years past 2008. As you can see, we've been doing this a long time already. Let's see. So this topic is really incredibly important, has always been important, especially since the passage of the ADA. But I will say in my career, I do not believe I've ever discussed ADA, the interactive process, and reasonable accommodations more than I have since COVID. Okay, obviously, makes sense. It is a worldwide pandemic that has had so much impact on our day-to-day lives that there really is no surprise that this conversation has just really boomed, more so now than ever. But also what's important is this is Disability Awareness Month. So I think it was important to highlight and recognize that this is an important month. We want to praise the accomplishments of those individuals with disabilities who have persevered through so much and who have brought so much to the workplace, and so much to the workplace that maybe they wouldn't have felt welcomed, prior to the 90s, so say in the 70s or 80s. But the landscape has changed so much. So what's our conversation going to be? Obviously, it's the ADA and the Amendments Act. We're going to discuss what is required under the ADA, what is this interactive process and what does that mean? What are some options for reasonable accommodation? I know in your mind, probably like my mind, sometimes that just sounds like so much, but sometimes the reasonable accommodations can be very small. So we're going to talk about some of the options that are available to all of us. And then the last piece is, no conversation since March of 2020 would be complete without mentioning COVID-19 and what the interplay is with that. So we'll conclude the conversation today with talking about COVID-19. What are some of those accommodations? What potentially do we need to continue to navigate through as we hopefully are drawing this pandemic more towards an endemic and hopefully done. So keeping fingers crossed on that. At any point in time, feel free to throw a question in the chat. We do not have a large group, so if you want to take yourself off mute and ask the question, feel free to do that as well. Rachel will be reading the chat questions, but I really want this to be, talking about interactive, I really want this session to be interactive. So, if it's a question that you have, chances are somebody else is thinking that same question. And that way we can make sure that this is a very rich conversation so that we can get as much as we possibly can out of our time together.
And I'm keeping a close eye on the chat window. So if you guys pop any questions in there at any point, I'll add them into the conversation. Don't be afraid.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for today. And every day, to that matter. So the Americans with Disability Act is, you're going to see right from the get-go, applies to employers with 15 or more employees with an asterisk. So if you have less than 15, I'm watching the participants. I don't want everybody to start dropping off now, depending on your employer size. The reason the asterisk is there is there's also, in addition to just what the minimum requirement is for the ADA, we have to be very cognizant of state, city, county, and other local ordinances. It's highly probable, regardless of your size, that you have some responsibilities that you need to comply with. So I don't really want us to focus on the 15 or more, because it's, like I said, very, very probable that some of your local ordinances will require compliance in some way, shape, or form. So those are one of those things we really never focus on. The other pieces you'll see here, the bolded pieces. So one thing that, I said how large the legislation is for the ADA, and it is quite massive. But one thing that they did was really highlight certain words that are very unique in some respects to this legislation that really helps with the explanation. So those are the things that we're going to focus on through the conversation today. So employers are prohibited from discriminating against individuals with disability. So if we think back to the overall Equal Employment Opportunity, the EEO, that protects employees from being discriminated against on the basis of race, sex, creed, religion, national origin. Then age came a few years later. Then the ADA came in 1990. So this is just another piece of those anti-discrimination laws that we have to be very cognizant of in our day-to-day work responsibilities. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations. So that's some very important verbiage to this legislation. To individuals who are qualified for a job, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about being qualified for a job. So the employee may perform the essential functions of the job unless it poses an undue hardship. So an undue hardship to the employer. And we'll talk about that more when we get to some of those reasonable accommodations. And then restricts medical inquiries and medical examinations. That goes back to that interactive process that's so critical that we'll be talking about shortly. So starting with, what is a disability? So it's clearly, some things are very apparent. So an individual that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Okay, so these are going to be those that for the most part, they're very apparent, or the associate has come to you and they've shared that they've got this situation they're dealing with and they need your help. It could be an individual that has a record or history of such an impairment. So somebody that you know of in the past that has a disability or has had a disability. But the one that's the most, I think one of the bigger takeaways already is this one in teal here, the individual that is regarded or perceived as having such an impairment. This is kind of the danger zone. Okay, this is the area that we want to be so careful that we don't regard somebody or perceive somebody as having a disability that may not. Because as soon as we regard them or perceive them as having a disability, they fall under the ADA. And now they have all the protections under the ADA. And remember the key word we said here, employers are prohibited from discriminating against an individual with a disability. That means we're prohibited from, we don't want to discriminate against anybody, but now we have potentially offered protection for somebody that doesn't have a disability. We've just incorrectly regarded or perceived them as having that. And this is critical when, if you don't know for sure, minimize the conversation about it. Don't put anything in writing. Be very, very cautious. We don't want to label somebody incorrectly. Feel free to chime in any questions. So we talk about, so what are these major life activities? And I'm going to scare you with the next screen because it's major bodily functions. So major life activities are everything that, for the most part, those of us that do not have a disability, we just take for granted. We can get up, we got up this morning, we were able to, take a shower and get dressed, and we can make our own breakfast or our own coffee, walking, standing, you could go out for a walk or run later, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and just working in general. So those are major life activities. It's those ADLs that we talk about when you look more at healthcare, those activities of daily living that we often do take for granted. But if we look down further on the list, concentrating. So when I go back up to this in teal, an individual that is regarded or perceived as having such an impairment, and then you match that up with concentrating, we could actually make somebody fall under the ADA by just making an assumption that they have ADHD. So that's going to really be one of the bigger takeaways, is just being very cognizant and cautious of what we're perceiving sometimes, when maybe that's not at all what it is. And then the bodily functions, I really think this may have been one of the ones that got added under the amendments, or at least it got expanded. So the bodily functions, everything from digestive, bowel, but look at the very last bullet. So when the Amendments Act passed, reproductive functions. So that could be potentially somebody having a difficult time getting pregnant may fall under what is a disability. So that's why this is so far reaching and why it's such an important conversation, just so we have a very strong understanding as to how broad it is. And then making that, once we have a thorough understanding of how broad the topic is, then, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that we're doing everything we can do to not discriminate against an individual with a disability, and that we're providing all of these other pieces that we talked about that we're going to get to next. So qualified employed. So what is a qualified employee? There is not one piece of legislation that requires you to create a job description. So you're like, whew, can take that off my to-do list, right? Okay, not so fast. So obviously job descriptions are important to have, but if we can pour through every piece of legislation and says, okay, Tammy and Rachel, Kathy, who's on the call, why are we doing job descriptions? Why do I have to do job descriptions? At its face value, you don't have to do job descriptions. Of course, it's important to do job descriptions, but there's nothing critical to saying it is an absolute requirement and you can't get through today without doing them. But this legislation does come back and say, Mr. Miss Employer, if you have job descriptions, they need to look a certain way. And that's where we get into how that job description looks. You have the, what's the objective of the job? And then what are the essential or primary duties of the job? And then you might have some secondary or non-essential functions of the job. And then what does that individual need to possess to do the job? Do they have to be able to drive? Do they have to be able to type, use a computer? If I use 2020 lingo, right? Do they have to be able to use a computer? Do they need to be able to sit, stand, lift. So you've all seen those job descriptions and where we have those physical qualifications. Okay, that's the outline that a job description needs to look in order to be compliant with the ADA, even though you don't technically have to have one. It just becomes potentially vital so that we can make sure that we're in full compliance. So a qualified employee, I'm going to back up again a little bit further and just talk about, putting on that overarching umbrella that nobody creates a job unless you have work that needs to be done. Okay, that sounds like such a, well, duh, of course, Tam. So that's kind of the mindset, when you're dealing with what are the essential functions of the job. It's really, why does this job exist? Why did I create this job? Why do I need this job? What are the components that my business will not run as smooth if I don't have somebody doing this job? Okay. That's the lens. That's the only lens that we need to look at when we're working towards creating the job description, and more importantly, creating those essential functions. So the essential functions, once again, the absolutes why that position was created. It can be 5, 10, it can be up to 20, bullet points, but why that job, you've created that job, why is it critical? Why is it critical for your business to move forward? Then you might have secondary functions, and I'm building for a reason. You might have secondary functions. Those are things that they're nice to, I think secondary functions, there should just be a few of them. They need to be things that somebody else can do. If you need that person to do the secondary function, not the person, but the job, critical differentiation, then becomes back to the essential function. So true secondary function is going to be, oh, Judy lives near the bank, and so on her way home every day, I'm going to give her that assignment and she's going to stop by the bank. But if Judy loses her ability to drive for whatever reason, but she can still perform the rest of the position, that secondary function goes away. And now Bob does it. Somebody else is going to do that role. But maybe, no, Judy has to do that. Like, I have nobody else that can do that function. So that becomes then a primary function. So I think you can kind of see the nuance. Running an errand or taking on a special project that is just, that's just kind of anecdotal to their position. And then a qualified employee, so now we've got it written on paper. Now, who can do that job? Okay, so now we want to hire somebody who can perform those essential functions. They have the right skill set, they have the right education, they have other job-related requirements of the position. So that's all the foundation that's critical to build upon when we start talking about what does a reasonable accommodation look like. Now, I'll pause for any questions before we move on.
No questions, Tammy. Smooth sailing so far. That means everybody knows exactly what we're saying.
If I don't make myself stop, I'll talk all day long. I have to warn everybody. I could just keep going. So what are the essential functions? So the person must be able to perform those essential functions. And that holds true. I'm going to take my ADA hat off for a second and just talk about general employee relations now for just a half a minute because I have your attention. But we never want to get, the essential functions, like I said, are the reason the job exists. We never want to get to a point where we're starting to take away those essential functions so that a person can be successful. And that is regardless of any reason, right? Okay, so it could just be that they can't set their alarm clock on time, so you're going to change their hours, although it's going to hurt your business, or that somebody just no longer can do the position because of, and then fill in the blank. Okay. These are true functions that can't be reassigned to somebody else. If your receptionist needs to be there at 8 a.m. to open the office and get the coffee and do the things that are critical to opening your office, well, that's his or her starting time. That can't be reassigned to anybody else. And it's crucial elements of the job description, like we already said. And lifting is a good one here, especially when we're talking about the ADA. Does the position truly require somebody to be able to lift 50 pounds or more? That's not abnormal for a job description. We may get to a point that's something that we cannot reasonably accommodate. So that's where the conversation comes in, the interactive process. So what does that mean? I keep talking about this reasonable accommodation and the interactive process, and what does all of that mean? So it starts with, and I think this is critical, this first bullet here, a request from the employee. Okay, I already said, several slides ago that we can't perceive somebody. We shouldn't make somebody or perceive them or regard them as having a disability if we're not aware that that's truly the case. So you're like, well, Tim, how am I going to know? Okay, well, it needs to start from the employee. So that's why it's so important to have that job description, explain what the essential functions or the primary functions of the job are. Make sure that employee or candidate can actually perform those functions. And then if they come back and say, well, I can perform those functions, however, this is what's going on and this is what I need. Okay, so we really want to avoid us on the employment side from starting that conversation, because we don't want to walk into a conversation where now we're regarding somebody and we're wrong. Okay, so some things are just obvious. I mean, if they come in with crutches and a broken leg, okay, well, that's obvious. So we can have that conversation. They come in a wheelchair, we need to have that conversation because it's obvious something is going on, and maybe we do need to rearrange the cubicles, or we need to do something. We need to make sure that somebody can get through. My daughter was just on crutches a few months back, and if she's been on crutches a few times, but whoa, it can be difficult. So something as simple as crutches, it's only simple because I've never been on crutches, knock on wood, but I know those of you that have been on crutches, it's a ton. I know it was hard just navigating her, dealing with, I think all of us, when we had, my kids are now young adults, but babies and strollers. I mean, we loved having all of those ramps going into the shopping stores and all those conveniences offered. So some things are just going to be obvious, and it's okay to have those conversations. Somebody shows up, they just had major knee or hip surgery, they're able to come back to work, but they're in a wheelchair. All right, what do we need to do to the workplace? Okay, where is the ramp? Do they have access to a bathroom that has the guardrail? Can we move their cubicle so that something's easier for them? Okay, those are the conversations that start leading into this interactive process. I just let us off the hook now with my very, very, very simple conversations. Those are the easy ones. Those are the ones that are like, Tim, those aren't the hard ones. And you're right. The interactive conversations, the ones where it's not quite so obvious. It's the request from the employee that you're like, I don't know what I can do. I don't know if I can do this. I think I need more information from the doctor. I don't even know what they're asking for. That's where it becomes much more difficult. But the idea with the interactive process is once the employee has submitted this request, be it verbal or in writing, but at least now you're aware. Now we're going to sit down and we're going to start asking the questions. What is it that they need? And remember, we're focusing it all back on those essential job functions. That's what we're focused on. What does this employee need or potentially applicant need in order to perform those particular pieces of the job? And then if we get to a point that there just isn't anything, well, then that's a different conversation. Accommodations can take many, many forms, but one thing an accommodation can't do to you is create an undue hardship. An undue hardship, once again, it's kind of a, it depends. Okay, so much. That's why you guys love HR, because everything we answer is it depends, right? So what a large, huge employer like a Coca-Cola can do, is not what your 25 or 30 person, business can do. It looks different. What may not be an undue hardship for somebody else may absolutely be a huge undue hardship for you. And I think one piece, another bullet that we could add here is just that overarching safety feature and safety function to make sure that whatever we are establishing keeps everybody safe, not only the individual with the disability, but everybody else within the workplace. You know, I worked, my first job out of college was at a local hospital. And you know, we did hire a pretty significant number of individuals that had varying degrees of disability. And we would have, blind employees. We had completely deaf, hearing impaired employees. And we had to establish within the certain departments, if they were hearing impaired, certain types of mechanisms so they could hear in the event of fire or the event of an emergency. Well, it was a large hospital with a couple thousand employees. Okay, what the hospital could do, or potentially the grant the hospital could get, is different than what many employers can do. So it's, you know, coming to that agreement as to what will work and what won't work. Does anybody have an example they can throw out? You can always change the names to share the story, but any examples? All right, well, think on it if you have one.
We got something. Let's see.
Okay.
Sandra, so if an employee thinks someone is showing signs of dementia, if an employer thinks someone is showing signs of dementia, but the person does not realize it, you can't say anything.
No, and I would not.
Employer just documents in performance reviews the items where they are not performing. Basic functions of the job are not being accomplished. Uh-oh, what happened? Looks like we have...
Did I lose you, Rachel? Did everybody else hear me?
We can hear you, Tammy.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay. Looks
All
like
right.
there was a situation, but we're back. So
Okay.
yeah, if you want to just speak to that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I'm not sure, Rachel, if you were still reading or if you were starting to answer the question, but you absolutely hit the nail on the head. So really, we don't want to regard or perceive somebody as. All we can really do is hold the individual accountable to doing the position that exists. Okay, and that's once again, not to harp on it, but that goes back to the reason we want to have those job descriptions. We want their buy-in to say that this is exactly what is required of the position. And when somebody is not able to perform it for whatever reason, we go back and say, hey, I've noticed this lately, or let's have a conversation over this particular work item or function, whatever it might be, or complaints, whatever might be coming in. And you have to potentially start the counseling process or the written warnings, the progressive discipline. And through that process, that's when the employee may say, hold on, there's something I need to tell you. Okay, so that could be, we always want to hold the individual accountable to doing the job that's required that you need done. And that's why I started there talking about job descriptions. You have that position created for a reason. You have put dollars to pay that person for a reason, and your business will be negatively impacted if they don't do those responsibilities. And so we want to hold the individual accountable regardless of, to make sure that they're doing the position. So that's when you have those conversations, and those are tough conversations. We get it. We understand those are really hard conversations, particularly where you do think something is going on. But start with the conversation, what you're seeing is as far as performance issues. And then if the employee says, wait, I've had a conversation with my doctor, this is something I want to share with you. Okay, now we go back into that, or we go into that interactive process. And it may be something you want to think about. You may want to say, and I would highly encourage you to, I would personally, as many years as I've been doing this, my colleagues will tell you, I don't walk into an interactive conversation without really doing my homework and really having some thoughtfulness prior to walking in, because they're not easy conversations to have. Okay, so I don't know if that helped. Is there another question in the chat or comment in the chat, Rachel?
Yeah, she said that wasn't a real example, just curious about how to handle that.
Excellent example. And I will say right now, in my entire career, probably the ones that are most difficult, and it's probably because they pull at the heartstrings, is that employee that you've had that's worked with you or worked with your company for 20, 30 years. And they've been a loyal, good employee. And now they just for whatever reason, can't do the job. Okay. And but they don't recognize it. They want to still work. They still want to do the job. And those are tough. I know probably everybody on this call has had that situation before, or at least they know of it, be it a family member or a neighbor or even them themselves at work. And those are tough. Those are the ones that absolutely are very, very emotionally driven. And we want to do what's right for all parties, though. And that's where, where the conversations do become quite difficult. But with, honesty and, the accountability piece and maybe a little creativity on the reasonable accommodations, we can usually get to success. So examples of reasonable accommodations, we've talked about it a lot. So we're kind of going through this interactive process. You're starting to collect information. You don't have to have all the answers. Okay, we're going to let you off the hook here for the HR team members that are on the call. We don't have all the answers all the time. Okay, so don't feel like you have to have everything when you walk into these conversations. It's a process. We're going to start, and that's kind of why I think they use the EEOC. Requires this interactive process, and that's the words they use because they know it's a process. It's a little bit of a back and forth, and you may have to say, "Can I get more information from your doctor?" I had a probably an easy example, just somebody that came and requested it says here an adjustable chair, but this was a pretty fancy chair. And I said, well, okay, I get it, but I'm not really seeing that in your doctor's note. Can you go back to your doctor and ask for these additional pieces of information? So that we can make the determination is what is the right chair to purchase, or what is the right headset to purchase. I will say if it's something a lower cost like that, I use air quotes because I know some of these things can be expensive, but sometimes I put the responsibility back in the employee's lap and say, hey, why don't you, I've done my research. It seems like based on what your doctor is recommending, this is a decent price range. Why don't you go and look and try out some different chairs or try on some different headsets to see what's going to work for you, and then bring me a receipt, and then give them some parameters. Okay, just because they need these accommodations doesn't mean that we, the employer, are having to do all the legwork. It's a partnership process. Examples of reasonable accommodation. 100%, the reason I have telephone headset is the number one, because that is absolutely the number one. It is, be it somebody a little hard of hearing or head and neck, there's a reason, maybe it's a twisting and turning, they request a headset. So we use extreme examples sometimes, but sometimes what the person is requesting or requiring based on working with their doctor isn't that big. So headset, number one. Number two, adjustable chair. So those are the things routinely I've already told you it's more than 30 years, routinely that I receive. Changing the layout of cubicles, I put this as third because really I've actually had that request several times in the past, 5, 6, 7 years. So that has come up more often. Raised or adjustable desk. Those used to be outlandishly expensive. I'll give you a little hint. They're a little cheaper now on Amazon, and sometimes they're not near as fancy. But there's ways we can work around some of these things without really spending a significant amount of money. And maybe, the adjustable desk comes when the doctor says, okay, they need to stand and sit. We've all seen those notes, right? They come back usually from a workers' comp injury, but it's the same idea. They just need where they can stand and sit. They need to take frequent walks, and this would be a great way to provide that accommodation. Software for hearing impaired, had one of those not too long ago. Screen magnifier, what a great idea for visually impaired. Extended leave time, that has come up quite often recently, and I think a little bit of it because of COVID, but an offer for extended leave time. Talk about that a little bit more when we get to some of the COVID conversations. Allowance for a later start time, maybe to accommodate medical treatments. If you're required to comply with the FMLA, you've got more than 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. This may or may not be a reasonable accommodation. This may be just a requirement under intermittent leave. Provision for rest periods throughout the day. Potentially that could be a viable reasonable accommodation. And then flexible scheduling. Some can, some can't. It really just depends on your workplace. And keep in mind with any of these things, some work units within your company may have more flexibility than others, and that's okay. You can have work departments or locations that have more flexibility. The key is that you're just offering the same to everybody and treating everybody the same, with similar situations. And likewise, you may have areas that absolutely cannot be flexible. Like, no, that's the job. This is what I need. This is the reason the job exists. The lights have to be turned on at this point in time, and they can't be turned off until this point in time. Other examples of reasonable accommodations that you guys have found or that have worked. Okay.
Let's see, we've got, what does Hope say? I have current requests for a stand-up desk and extended leave time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hope, I will say those we have seen quite often recently, definitely in the past few years. So yeah, the stand-up desk, once again, that may be a requirement to go have the individual, part of this process is have the individual go back to the doctor if you need more information, if you need something more definitive. You often see things like, well, it would help if. Okay, well, that's not a requirement. It would help if is a suggestion. Okay, and I'm not saying we're not going to meet somebody's suggestion, and offer it to them, but we're certainly not going to offer something that's going to be extremely expensive if we can't afford it because it's a suggestion. So those are sometimes often where I'll go back and say, please go get some more information from your doctor because I'm hearing your request for this, but that's not what I'm seeing. Okay, and can you get us some more information?
To just throw I don't call it a monkey wrench, but one thing that we have never really experienced was when this is a new staff person, and we were sitting with them going through their new hire paperwork, and they're giving you their I-9 documents and a W-4, and the person had a letter from her physical therapist, and that was part of her new hire. And we're, being human, thinking, it would have been really nice to have these conversations during the interview process or during the letter of offer process. But your team was very cautious in saying, once they step in that door and they do that paperwork, they're yours. And you have to accommodate to the best of your ability. There's no thinking, I wish we would have known then. You have it now. So you have to,
Right.
treat every instance with the care and respect that, that's required of an employer. So I just wanted to let people know that you never know when those accommodations are going to come to you. You just need to be prepared to act in a timely fashion.
Excellent.
Well, and also to that point, you want to be careful about that conversation during the hiring process. You don't want any possible situation where maybe you chose not to hire that person after you found that out. So, something to be careful of there, it is kind of irrelevant on the front side. So, it shouldn't affect your decision whether or not to hire somebody when they can do all those essential functions that we talked about.
Yes.
Yeah, and one thing to consider that might help is when you're interviewing the candidate, have the job description there and have them read the job description. And you can say, this is the requirements of the position. Are you able to do all of these? You can even go as far as to put the question on your application that says, can the person with or without reasonable accommodation perform the essential functions of the position? Now, we have to make sure they know what the essential functions of the position are. And, as, technology has moved forward, people apply for positions based on just a posting and it's through the applicant tracking system, so it becomes really where that conversation could take place is just as part of the interview and just sharing and just having, are you able to do this? And even to the point is, this job starts at 8. Can you be here on time? We can't ask them, do you have a car and can you drive here? The answer to the question is, can you get here by that time? And it's going to require routine lifting throughout the day of 50 pounds and, making sure, so you're really just telling them what the requirements are and, ensuring that they're in agreement that yes, I can do the job that you have available. Then when you move forward and like, you know, we were just talking about, they're filling out the paper. I've had all of this happen to me, by the way. You know, they're filling out the paperwork and, you know, they're going through everything and they're like, oh, by the way, I know you said the lifting was 50 pounds. I can only do 25. Okay. Well, go through the conversation and, you know, is there a way to accommodate? You know, is this person always working with a buddy that somebody could help with the lifting? Yes, no, no. Okay. Sometimes that job offer gets rescinded. Okay. I've had to do that. Not easy conversations. It's not something you really want to walk into, but you know, the expectation was set from the beginning. The person could do the job. Then they said, oh, and truly, I think my example was exactly what I said, lifting, which does make it a little simpler. And they couldn't do the job. I had no choice but to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to rescind the offer, you know, so.
And Rachel J said she's had quite a few requests that follow the expiration of FMLA.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so to Rachel's point, I think all members of our HR team have seen that exponentially. Whether it was a COVID related reason or not, I don't know, but I telling you, it feels like we've received those requests exponentially, you know, really since the pandemic started for all different types of reasons. And it's possible that an extended leave time could be a reasonable accommodation. Okay? So it's just something to keep in mind. I think it's more possible and plausible when it's just, you know, hey, Tammy, I need 2 more weeks. Here's my doctor's note. He says I can come back on November 1st. Well, it's kind of hard on October 21st to say you can't accommodate that, right? Because you've already accommodated it for a month or two. Where it becomes tricky is when they say, I don't know when I'm going to be able to come back. You know, so we have to really see like what is reasonable. And all of these conversations, unfortunately, everyone has its own uniqueness. You know, it's just something we have to really look at each time it comes up because the nuances are unique. So one thing before I move off of this slide, there's a phenomenal resource. So something else just you want to jot down, it's called the Job Accommodation Network. It was created back in the early 90s when the Americans with Disability Act was passed. I think it used to be maybe under a governmental entity. I'm pretty sure it's privatized and probably nonprofit by now. Don't quote me on that, but it feels like it is. But this is just an amazing resource where you can call, or they've got a ton of information on their website. So it's the Job Accommodation Network. I believe it's jan.org. Phenomenal information, phenomenal guidance. You can call, I've called them over the years over any number of things where they just will have an open, healthy conversation with you over what the particular situation is. And they will offer some accommodations sometimes that are very low in cost. They may even be aware of some different grant options or different nonprofits that can help financially with these situations. So it's a fantastic tool just to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody, or just to read all of the resources that are available on their site. So it's, you know, it's just one of those little hints on the HR side of things that we use on a very, very, very routine basis.
So I have another question from Debbie Sparkman, and she's saying, what do you do when you have a longtime employee who could do the job description when they started, but now maybe can no longer do the lifting associated with that?
Okay. So they were able to do the lifting and now they can't. Okay. So I think that goes back to that interactive process, and ask them like, how long is this expected? Is this temporary? You know, is it just, maybe you've tweaked your back? Okay, I'm sure that's probably not your question because it wouldn't be coming a question. Is it long-term? And can you accommodate? You know, is this somebody that you will have, you know, do they have a buddy system where somebody else can assist with the lifts when they're required? Or truly, is there nobody else around? You know, I started my career in hospitals, and then I spent 10 years with hospice. And so we were obviously hiring nurses that went to patient homes, and they were the only nurse that would be going. There may be other family members there, but chances are they're of advanced age as well. And the lifting restrictions were pretty tough. I mean, I was not able to say, long-term, I could accommodate a lifting restriction, because they never knew at any point in time when they would walk into a house, people lived alone. They may have to pick them up off the floor when they got there. They may be able to call non-emergency 911, but so we were pretty strict with the lifting restrictions. I would always work towards accommodating somebody during a pregnancy because it was short-term. Using that as an example, I'm sure there's plenty of other examples, but there are times where there's just kind of that go, no go. And once again, back to you may not be able to accommodate. I had a pretty seemingly simplistic example, kind of the same idea. Somebody who had such severe allergies, every time her allergies went awry, she got asthmatic pneumonia within hours. And I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it myself. Literally within hours, she would go from an allergy attack to asthmatic pneumonia. And after multiple attempts of trying to see what we could do, her working in an environment where we couldn't control smokers, dogs, pressure cleaning, any number of things where you're going into people's homes and the environment changes.
Perfume. Perfume, exactly. And so we had to, come to the conclusion that the particular place I was doing HR at the time, I was like, this just isn't the job for you anymore. Tough conversation to have, but it was the truth of it. She needed to work in a more controlled environment. So kind of our, final slide, and we're doing great on time, so it's good to see. Want to just, this is probably more open conversation, but we're dealing with COVID-19. I know all of us on the HR team, we've seen these conversations just really, it's been an exponential increase on conversations regarding reasonable accommodations, extended leaves, like Rachel just said, paperwork from a physician asking for, we've got some medical situations going on. So we wanted just to take a few minutes and talk about, policy considerations. If you're going to, look at a vaccine mandate or vaccine with a testing option. We don't know, by the way, what OSHA is going to come back with for employers of greater than 100. Nothing has been formally published yet. That will, of course, change this first comment here on policy considerations. But you may be in a particular location or maybe in an industry, you may be mandated by virtue of federal government contracts to require the vaccine. If that's the case, then that opens up the conversation for reasonable accommodation regarding a medical exemption. And what does that look like? One of the accommodations could be the testing, if that is afforded and a possible option for that individual. Hopefully we won't have to handle another COVID-19 surge. Everybody please knock on wood and keep your fingers crossed right now. But in the event we do, we're going to go back to those conversations. Again, some people are going to request to work from home again. Is that a viable option or isn't it? Or do we look at alternate scheduling so that we have fewer people in the office? Are we going to require different types of testing? So these are all conversations, and they all head back towards these reasonable accommodations, and really just take a ton of creativity and what will work for your particular organization, what will still drive your business. And another, I think, probably big takeaway, particularly when we get to this slide, and we've talked a lot about why the position exists, what are the essential functions, and anytime you drive any decision back to business need and business necessity, you're always going to be in pretty safe charter territory, particularly when you act consistently. So we want to, keep the lenses on, keep those hats on where you're constantly, not only you're being consistent, but the decisions are being driven by your business. And that's going to, that will help you 100%. We just mentioned an extended leave. Okay, well, we've offered an extended leave for somebody, but now something has changed with the business. And now we can no longer offer that extended leave. That's the perfect reasoning to say to this individual, I know I've been able to accommodate this leave for so long, but if you're not able to come back by such and such date, we're really going to need to either, probably need to separate your employment,
or I'm gonna need to move you to another role. Something's going to, because this is happening with my business. I got a new contract, I lost a contract, I got a new buyer, I sold, whatever it is, fill in the blank. What has changed with your business? And then one thing the DOL came out with fairly recently is that long COVID. So it's those long, we've probably all met, at least a handful of people that just have they're no longer contagious, the long lingering COVID symptoms. They have said it possibly falls under the ADA. So I just threw that out because it was such a timely connection that we, somebody else that we would need to fully comply with the ADA because they're dealing with a COVID related issue. So that was the end of my slide. So now just open up the conversation, questions, anything you want to add.
Chat box is quiet.
I hope this was helpful. Certainly not easy conversation.
Absolutely.
We get it. And, when those conversations come up, don't hesitate to call us. We can help you kind of framework how that, how those answers are going to work with your associates.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, CertaPay is here for you whenever you have issues, questions, concerns, especially connected to COVID, if you've got any situations related to that. And coming up on the end of the year, any changes in compliance or issues, we will always keep you guys up to date. So Tammy, no other questions. So I think we have covered it for today.
Very good. Well, I enjoyed it. If you guys think of any other topics you would like us to present on, please always let us know, because we really want to make these sessions as interactive as possible and to bring the material to you that you are interested in hearing about.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you all.